The year 1357 dawned upon a fractured England, still reeling from the spectre of the Black Death, a pestilence that had cruelly winnowed families and fortunes alike. In the sun-dappled yet profoundly sorrowful halls of Harrington Hall, this grim inheritance was palpable. The air, once heavy with the scent of beeswax and the vibrant echoes of merriment, now carried the musty pall of neglect and the chilling silence of absence. Isolde Harrington was 18, but the deep violet shadows beneath her eyes spoke of a burden far older. The plague, that indiscriminate harvester, had claimed her parents within a span of weeks, leaving her and her older brother, Cillian, adrift in a sea of inherited debt. Cillian, the newly minted head of the family, possessed a heart full of grand, if ultimately feckless, intentions. He had sworn an oath to Isolde beneath the oak where their parents were interred, an oath to be her protector, her stalwart shield against a world that had suddenly turned sharp and cold. For a time, she clung to the warmth of his promise. Cillian was handsome, charming, and possessed the easy confidence of a man accustomed to having his way. But beneath the veneer of noble certainty lurked a crippling lack of discipline. The debts, initially manageable, grew like famished wolves. Cillian, in a desperate attempt to staunch the hemorrhaging of their fortune, made a series of disastrous investments and foolish wagers. The quiet whispers of creditors turned into loud, demanding shouts. The family's few remaining parcels of land were mortgaged, the family jewels sold for a pittance. Finally, the wolves cornered him. His debtors were no longer content with promissory notes or promises of future bounty. They demanded blood or the equivalent, a life for a life, a coin for a coin. And the most relentless, the most terrifying of these creditors was a man named Algernon Thorne. Thorne was a moneylender whose true business was the acquisition and subjugation of souls. His hands were thick, his face a landscape of oily avarice, and his eyes, a shallow, muddy brown, held a chilling lack of soul. Thorne did not simply want Cillian's meager land. He wanted something living, something pristine, something that could be used, displayed, and broken. He wanted Isolde. The proposal, no, the demand, had been delivered one chillingly cold afternoon in the privacy of Cillian's study. Cillian, cornered and sweating with the fever of his own cowardice, had tried to refuse. He truly had. But Thorne merely leaned back in the worn leather chair, his voice a gravelly whisper that promised ruin. "You have nothing, Harrington, nothing but that delicate bloom you keep hidden away. I will forgive your entire debt, every last shilling and every ruinous interest rate, if you give me your sister. Do not think of this as selling her, Cillian," Thorne had purred, a vile parody of sympathy on his lips. "Think of it as saving your life and the last shred of your family's honor. Because if you refuse, I will not only take the hall and have you imprisoned, but I will make very sure that Isolde herself is cast out onto the street with nothing but the dress on her back." The pressure, the fear, the agonizing, selfish need for survival. Cillian had looked at the prospect of the debtor's prison, the cold, the filth, the slow death of a gentleman, and the blood had drained from his courage. He betrayed his oath. He betrayed Isolde. Isolde knew nothing of the compact until the evening before she was due to be taken. She sat at her embroidery frame, stitching a forget-me-not pattern that seemed a cruel mockery of her current life, when Cillian entered her sitting room. He did not look at her. "Isolde," his voice was strangely flat, devoid of its usual fraternal warmth, "you are to prepare yourself. Algernon Thorne is taking you on as a ward. He is a good man, a man of commerce, and he will see to your welfare. It is an arrangement I have made to settle the last of the family's worries." Her needle froze in the linen. "A ward? Cillian, I do not understand. He is a moneylender, not a guardian. Why would he take on the responsibility of a dowryless girl?" He finally met her gaze, and Isolde saw the raw, hideous scar of his guilt. He is owed a great deal, a life debt, you could say, and his price for forgiving it all was your hand. Not as a ward, Isolde, as a possession. He could not bring himself to use the word wife or bride, for Thorne had made it sickeningly clear that his interest was in ownership, not matrimony. The air left her lungs in a soundless gasp. Her delicate hands trembled, the embroidery slipping to the floor. You sold me?" The question was a single fragile shard of ice. Cillian sagged, his handsome features twisted in a mask of self-loathing. "He would have ruined us both, Isolde, jailed me, cast you out. It was the only way. He promised you would be safe, well kept. Please try to understand. I had no other choice." But in her heart, she knew he had had a choice. He had chosen his own neck over her life. Isolde rose, her slender figure imbued with a sudden, terrible dignity. She did not weep. The tears were too deep for mere weeping. "You swore you would protect me, Cillian," she said, her voice a desolate whisper. "You swore upon their graves, and now you have paid your debt with my freedom. May God forgive you, for I cannot." The next night, the air in Algernon Thorne's dimly lit, garishly furnished manor was thick with a brutal anticipation. Isolde, dressed in a simple gown of deep blue, stood stiffly in the great hall. She felt like an exhibit, a prize won in a dirty game. Thorne, flushed with cheap wine and victory, stood near a massive oak table covered in scrolls of parchment, the very documents of Cillian's debt, now torn and cast aside. He was boasting to a small circle of his cronies, his voice a loud, triumphant sneer. "And so, the fair Miss Harrington is now mine," he crowed, gesturing towards Isolde with a meaty hand. "A costly prize, you say? Perhaps. But I assure you, gentlemen, the pleasure of breaking a proud lineage is worth more than gold." Isolde stood with her spine straight, her chin slightly raised, refusing to meet his repulsive gaze. She was humiliated, yes, but she would not allow him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She was a Harrington, and though her brother had failed her, she would not fail herself. She would face her ruin with grace. As Thorne advanced towards her, his muddy eyes gleaming, a sudden, inexplicable shift occurred. The coarse laughter died in the throats of his companions. The very air seemed to crackle and freeze. A sharp, resounding crash echoed from the main entrance. The massive iron-studded doors of Thorne's hall were thrown open with a violent force that shook the tapestries on the walls. A figure filled the aperture, framed by the cold night air. He was darkness and authority personified. Tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and cloaked in a velvet-lined mantle of the deepest midnight hue, the man moved like a predator surveying its domain. His presence was not merely noticed, it was an active, oppressive weight. The oil lamp seemed to dim in deference to the shadow he cast. This was no ordinary man. This was Damien Ashthorne, the enigmatic Duke of Ravenscar. The name alone was a shiver of dread and legend throughout the kingdom. Ravenscar was a remote mountainous fortress, and its duke was rarely seen in court or common society. He was reputed to be a man of ice, a fearsome warrior, a tactician who had no patience for the petty squabbles of the nobility or the greasy hands of merchants. Rumors clung to him like mist, that he was cursed, that his bloodline was tainted by ancient magic, that the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw was earned in a battle not of this world. His temper was legendary, his justice absolute and swift. He did not hurry. Each step of his highly polished leather boot on the stone floor was deliberate, a beat in a drum of impending doom. His face was a chiseled mask, arresting in its severe handsomeness, but devoid of any warmth. His hair was the color of raven feathers, and his eyes, a startling, piercing grey, swept over the room with devastating intensity, dismissing the whole assembly of Thorne's cronies as insignificant dust motes. They landed finally on Isolde. She could not breathe. His gaze was a physical touch, a cold assessment that stripped her bare yet somehow did not violate her. She was frail, yes, humiliated, unquestionably, but she met his stare. For a fleeting moment she saw not the feared duke, but a terrible, aching loneliness mirrored in those grey depths. The silence was a screaming thing. Algernon Thorne finally found his voice, a squeak of fear and outrage. "Your Grace, to what do I owe this honor?" Damien Ashthorne did not look at Thorne. His eyes were still locked on Isolde, examining the defiant set of her jaw, the tremor in her hands, the noble spirit refusing to break. "The girl!" The Duke's voice was deep, resonant, and utterly without inflection, like the grinding of a glacier. "She is a Harrington. She was recently sold to you to cover a debt." Thorne, recovering some of his usual bluster, puffed out his chest. "She is, Your Grace. A legal transaction, I assure you. I now own her contract. She is my possession." Damien Ashthorne moved his head a fraction, his gaze finally settling on the merchant, a single annihilating glance. "I find her price insufficient." Thorne blinked, confused. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." "Name your price for the debt forgiveness Cillian Harrington granted you," the Duke commanded, walking closer to the table where the torn parchments lay. Thorne, scenting an advantage, rubbed his thick fingers together. "It was a considerable sum, Your Grace. Enough to settle the Harrington estate's entire ruin. Double it," the Duke stated. It was not an offer, it was a decree. He reached into his mantle and produced a heavy leather pouch. No, not one, but two. He slammed them onto the table. The sound was a dull, satisfying thud, and the clear clink of gold coins spilled from a loosely tied neck. It was a fortune. "There," Damien Ashthorne said, his words measured and final. "I have paid double the price. Their debt is settled, the contract voided, and the girl now belongs to me." Thorne stared at the gold, his avarice warring with his fear of the Duke. The gold was undeniably tempting, a sum so vast it would set him up for a decade. But the sheer effrontery, the loss of his prized possession. "But, Your Grace, I had plans for her. She is mine." Damien Ashthorne's hand moved with lightning speed, not drawing a sword but simply resting his palm flat on the table, directly in the center of the torn debt contracts. The air grew perceptibly colder. "You will not speak of the Lady Isolde as a possession again, Thorne. You will take the gold, thank your petty gods for your unexpected windfall, and forget that this night ever happened. For if I ever hear a single rumor that you have spoken ill of the lady or her family, or if you ever cross my path again with your miserable machinations, I will not simply ruin you. I will ensure your ruin is so absolute that your own mother will forget your name. Do you understand?" The sheer venomous promise in the Duke's low voice broke Thorne completely. The merchant was trembling, his eyes glued to the gold and then, quickly, to the Duke's severe face. "Yes, Your Grace, perfectly. The transaction is complete. The Lady Isolde is yours." Without another word, Damien Ashthorne turned back to Isolde. He offered her no hand, no soft glance, only a terrifying, undeniable path out of the nightmare. "Lady Isolde," he said, his voice softer now, yet still demanding, "you are under my protection, come." Isolde, rooted to the spot, was caught between terror and incomprehension. She was saved, yes, but by a force as destructive and enigmatic as her captor had been cruel. She was merely exchanging one form of ownership for another, yet the difference felt immense. The first man wanted to break her. This one, she could not fathom what this man wanted. She lifted her head, her deep blue eyes searching his fathomless grey ones. "Why, Your Grace?" she whispered, the question barely audible. "Why me?" The Duke of Ravenscar said nothing in reply, but the intensity of his gaze answered the question in a way words never could. He simply turned and walked toward the doors, expecting her to follow, and she did. Isolde Harrington, sold to pay a family debt, walked out of the hall of Algernon Thorne and into the intimidating shadow of Damien Ashthorne, the feared Duke of Ravenscar, knowing that she had only traded one dangerous master for another, but at least this time her spirit was whole. The storm was over, but the blizzard had just begun. The Duke of Ravenscar offered no further explanation as they left the vile confines of Algernon Thorne's manor. The only word spoken in the echoing hallway was his command to his accompanying men, two enormous silent figures clad in the Duke's stark black livery, bearing the sigil of the Ashthorne Raven. "The carriage now, and ensure the merchant does not draw breath for the rest of the night without my knowledge." The threat was implicit and deadly. Isolde shivered, pulling her thin cloak tighter around her. Outside, the air was crisp, scented with pine and the promise of a sharp frost. A carriage of formidable size awaited them, its dark wood polished to a mirror sheen, emblazoned with the same terrifying raven. It was not the gilded, fashionable conveyance of a courtier, but a vehicle built for speed, strength, and intimidation, a piece of the fortress on wheels. The Duke assisted her into the carriage. It was not a gentle gesture of gallantry, but a firm, impersonal lift, as if she were a precious though inanimate object. The moment she was seated, he slid in opposite her, the great expanse of his cloak swallowing the light. One of his guards slammed the door shut, the heavy latch clicking like the hammer of a pistol. They were moving before Isolde could draw a full breath. The darkness inside the carriage was absolute, broken only by the meager, shifting light filtering through the small, high windows. Isolde could sense the Duke's presence, a dense, palpable gravity that drew all the oxygen from the space. She pressed herself into the corner, attempting to make herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. Minutes stretched into an hour, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the crunch of the wheels on the frozen earth. The tension became a sharp physical ache in her chest. She had to know. The question that had been choked back in Thorn's Hall now burned on her tongue. "Your Grace," she began, her voice a reedy whisper in the dark. He did not stir, yet the single syllable he issued was a distinct acknowledgement. "Yes." "Why?" she repeated, her voice gaining strength from the desperation that fueled it. "Why did you do this?" "I am of little consequence. I have no dowry left. My family is ruined, and my reputation is now irreparably damaged by this transaction. You paid a fortune, double what the wretch was owed. What payment do you expect from me?" The Duke finally moved. He leaned forward slightly, and in the sudden beam of a passing light, Isolde saw the harsh contours of his face, the deep-set, uncompromising grey eyes. "Payment?" His voice held a note of cold amusement. "You think I purchased you for coin, for the services rendered by a woman?" He paused, and the weight of his stare was immense. "I have infinite resources, Lady Isolde. I do not need a ruined girl to warm my bed or manage my household. I came for you because I recognized a price being placed upon a spirit that should not be for sale." Isolde swallowed, trying to decipher the cryptic declaration. "I am grateful for your rescue, Your Grace, more than words can express. But that is no answer. Why Isolde Harrington? There are countless ruined noblewomen in England." He settled back against the leather. "The answer is complex, lady. It concerns matters of lineage, of ancient promises, and of a debt far older than your brother's." He spoke of an ancient debt, but his actions had addressed a present one. This Duke was not merely eccentric. He was a man consumed by a driving, secret purpose. "I do not understand," she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. "You do not need to," he stated simply. "You need only understand this. You are coming to Ravenscar. You will be safe, you will be cared for, and you will live in comfort. Your reputation to the world that matters will be restored, for no man would dare speak ill of a woman under the protection of the Duke of Ravenscar. You have been placed in an enclosure of my making, and I expect only one thing in return." Isolde's heart leaped. "Ah, there it is," she thought grimly. "The catch." "What, Your Grace, name it?" "Obedience," he said, the word cutting through the darkness. "Absolute and unquestioning. You will remain within the walls of Ravenscar until I decide otherwise. You will not ask questions of my motives, my affairs, or my past. You will trust that I and only I will determine your future. Can you accept those terms?" He was demanding her freedom of will, her curiosity, her very agency. Yet compared to the grim fate awaiting her with Thorn, it was a palace of gilded captivity. She took a moment, looking out at the blurring landscape, accepting the inevitable. "I accept, Your Grace. I am yours to command, within the bounds of honor." A faint, almost imperceptible line appeared at the corner of his mouth, perhaps a rare smile, perhaps a shadow. "Honor, Lady Isolde, is what I intend to restore, and Ravenscar has very strict bounds." The next 3 days were a blur of cold travel. They spoke little. The Duke maintained a silent, almost intimidating vigil, often studying maps spread out on his lap, or simply staring out the window at the increasingly rugged landscape. Isolde, for her part, spent the hours observing him. Damien Ashthorne was a contradiction. He possessed a ruthless bearing, yet when he ordered a halt to their travel, he ensured the inn chosen was warm and clean, and that she was served a proper meal, untouched by his guards. He kept a respectful distance, never once making a suggestive glance or an untoward physical movement. He treated her not like a mistress, not like a prisoner, but like a valuable, if perplexing, guest. She noticed the details, The heavy, antique silver ring he wore, etched with a pattern she could not discern, the way he held his left hand stiffly, betraying an old injury, and most of all, the scar. The thin, silver-white line ran from his temple, across the high, rigid structure of his cheekbone, stopping just short of his jaw. It did not detract from his handsomeness. Rather, it added an aura of dangerous, lived experience, hinting at battles fought and costs paid. As they pressed further north, the land became wilder, the towns sparser. She realized they were heading toward the formidable mountain ranges of the north, a desolate, lonely region where the Ashthorne family had ruled for centuries, untouched by the politics and gossip of London. Finally, on the fourth afternoon, the driver drew the carriage to a halt atop a winding, icy pass. "Lady Isolde," the Duke's voice cut through her exhausted reverie, "behold the end of your journey." She looked out. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Ravenscar. It was not a castle built for luxury but for survival. Perched upon a jagged black outcrop that dominated the entire valley, the fortress looked less like a noble dwelling and more like a clawing extension of the mountain itself. Built of dark, unforgiving slate, it rose against the bruised grey sky, a mass of high, narrow towers, formidable battlements, and walls so thick they looked impervious to cannon fire. Smoke curled from only a few chimneys, giving the impression that the place was more mausoleum than home. Snow already dusted the high peaks, lending the landscape a savage, pristine beauty. But the fortress itself was intimidatingly grim. It was an ice fortress, built by men who valued defense and isolation above all else. "It is formidable, Your Grace," Isolde managed, the understatement feeling weak against the reality. "It is Ravenscar," the Duke confirmed, his gaze fixed on the fortress with a strange mix of pride and desolation. "It is the only place in England where you will truly be safe from the world, and more importantly, from your brother's lingering troubles." Her brother. The name brought a sharp stab of renewed pain. Cillian. What of him? The Duke turned to her, his expression unreadable. "He lives. He is debt-free. But he is a weak man who made a terrible choice, Lady Isolde. I left him with a warning, a very final warning to cease his foolishness. I have the papers that prove his debt is cleared, but I did not offer him a shilling more than that. He will survive, but he will have to live with the knowledge of his betrayal." This cold, absolute justice offered her a strange comfort. The Duke did not excuse Cillian, he merely contained the damage. The interior of Ravenscar was as imposing as its exterior. The great hall was cavernous, its stone walls hung with ancient tattered banners and formidable weaponry, all illuminated by the massive roaring fire in the hearth. The air, though cold, was spiced with the scent of burning logs and old metal. Isolde was led to a small, comfortable chamber and attended by a silent, grey-haired woman named Mrs. Elmes, who seemed as much a fixture of the cold stone walls as the tapestries. After a bath and a light supper, Isolde was summoned back to the Duke. She found him not in the great hall, but in a small, well-stocked library. It was the only room in the fortress that possessed a hint of warmth and scholarly endeavour. Damien sat behind a heavy oak desk, illuminated by a reading lamp, a massive leather-bound volume open before him. "Sit, Lady Isolde," he gestured to a chair. She sat, her back straight. "Your Grace, I appreciate the comfort, but I must know the terms of my stay. Am I a prisoner? A distant relative? How am I to be presented to your household?" The Duke closed his book, a sudden, heavy snap, and looked at her, his expression infinitely weary. "You are neither. You are a refugee, Lady Isolde, under my immediate and direct protection. My staff are few and fiercely loyal. They do not gossip, they obey. You will be introduced as Lady Isolde Harrington, a distant relation of a dear friend, who requires seclusion and peace for an indefinite period. No one will question it." He then pushed a small velvet-covered box across the desk. Isolde frowned. "What is this?" "Open it." She lifted the lid. Inside lay a single, stunning piece of jewelry, a necklace made of antique silver, heavy and intricately wrought, featuring a pendant carved in the shape of a flowering vine, entwined with a small, stylized raven. "It is beautiful, Your Grace," she murmured, lifting it. "It is not a gift. It is a mark," the Duke stated. "The vine represents the Harrington line, the raven the Ashthorne protection. It is a symbol of the ancient promise I mentioned, and its presence upon your neck serves two purposes. First, it tells my staff and any unwelcome visitors that you are untouchable. Second, it serves to remind you of your absolute adherence to the rules of Ravenscar. You will not leave the grounds alone. You will not send or receive letters without my explicit permission. And you will not, under any circumstances, try to discover the true nature of your presence here." The necklace felt cool and heavy in her hand, a silver chain of beautiful, binding obedience. She looked from the necklace to the Duke, her courage overriding her caution. "You speak of ancient promises, Your Grace. It sounds like a curse. Is that why you fear the world, and why the world fears you?" His eyes narrowed, and the atmosphere in the room plummeted 10 degrees. Isolde knew she had overstepped, but she could not pull the words back. After a long, agonizing silence, the Duke spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You are perceptive, Lady Isolde, but perception is a dangerous vice at Ravenscar. I will not tolerate attempts to pry into my life. However, since you have asked, I will give you this much. Yes, the Ashthorne line carries a heavy burden, a vow made centuries ago. I rescued you not for your merit, but because your very existence, Lady Harrington, is tied to the fulfillment of that vow." He rose, his great height dominating the room. "Now, wear the mark and retire. I have saved you from the hand of a cruel man, only to place you in the hand of fate. You will live here under my watchful eye until the vow is fulfilled, and until that day you are mine to protect, without claim, without affection, and without compromise. Understood?" Isolde stood, placing the heavy silver chain around her neck. The cold metal against her skin felt like a seal on a new contract. She met his gaze, her spirit unbroken. "Understood, Your Grace. I am under the raven's shadow." She turned and left the library, the weight of the necklace and the enormity of the Duke's cryptic declaration settling upon her. She had been bought not with gold, but with a piece of an ancient, terrifying destiny. Life within Ravenscar was a study in contrasts for Isolde. On one hand, she lived in a cold, massive structure that felt perpetually poised for a siege. On the other, she was accorded a level of material comfort she had not known since before the plague claimed her parents. Her suite of rooms was spacious and well heated, and she was provisioned with simple but high-quality garments suitable for the northern climate. Yet, despite the luxurious surroundings, she was a gilded cage's captive. The rules the Duke had set were rigorously enforced, not by active guards, but by the pervasive, unspoken authority of the household staff. Mrs. Elmes, the housekeeper, was a silent sentinel, her eyes sharp and knowing. She ensured Isolde was never idle, providing her with the necessary tools for embroidery, reading, and managing the Duke's small yet complex linen stores. The Duke himself was a phantom. Days would pass, sometimes a week, where Isolde would not catch a glimpse of him. He was often away, tending to his vast northern estates, or, she suspected, engaged in matters far more complex than farming. When he was present, the atmosphere of the castle shifted. It became charged with a palpable tension, like a sword unsheathed and held ready. Isolde never sought him out, honoring her vow of obedience. She spent her mornings in the library, losing herself in the musty comfort of ancient texts, careful to avoid the volumes that dealt with the Ashthorne lineage or the North's darker history. She spent her afternoons walking the inner courtyard, a small, safe square of stone, always acutely aware of the silver raven pendant resting against her collarbone, her beautiful shackle. It was precisely this enforced isolation and the lack of explanation that began to gnaw at her spirit, activating the very curiosity the Duke had warned her against. She had been bought not for love, or lust, or power, but for a vow. One cold afternoon, a sharp, unexpected knock interrupted her solitary reading. "Enter," Isolde called out. The door opened, and the Duke stood framed in the doorway, stark and imposing in his heavy black wool coat. It was the first time she had seen him in over 10 days. "Lady Isolde," he acknowledged her with a curt nod, closing the door and walking into the room, He did not ask to sit. He simply stood, radiating cold authority. "Your Grace," she replied, rising immediately. She waited for him to speak, resisting the impulse to inquire about his travels. He walked to the window, staring out at the sleeting rain that battered the stone. "I received a letter this morning from a magistrate in the south. Your brother Cillian is attempting to dispute Thorne's claim that the debt is fully settled. He claims he was coerced into the sale and believes he is owed a portion of the vast sum I paid for your release." Isolde's face flushed with a renewed wave of shame and disbelief. After all that had transpired, his betrayal, his freedom, he sought more coin. "He is well, then?" she asked, the bitterness sharp in her tone. "Physically, yes. Morally, no," the Duke replied, turning back to her. "He seeks to profit from your shame, Isolde. The magistrate's letter is dismissible. Cillian has no standing to argue the case. But the fact that he attempted it is proof enough of the character of the man you called your protector." The revelation was a fresh wound. Isolde walked to the fireplace, her hands gripping the mantelpiece to steady herself. "I know what you expect, Your Grace," she said, her voice strained. "You expect me to weep for my circumstances, to rage at my brother, or to beg you for vengeance. I will do none of these things. Cillian made his choice. I accepted that ruin the moment I stepped into your carriage, but I will not allow his weakness to be a reflection of my own spirit." She turned to face him, her blue eyes blazing with a fierce, quiet dignity that never failed to capture his attention. "I am indebted to you for my life and my honor, Damien Ashthorne, and I uphold the terms of your contract. But I will not apologize for my family's ruin, nor will I allow my brother's greed to define my character. My value is not measured by the depth of my despair." The Duke stood silently for a long moment, simply observing the fragile yet unyielding strength she displayed. Most women he encountered in the courts were brittle, prone to tears or manipulation. Isolde was neither. She possessed a core of iron wrapped in velvet. "I did not come here for an apology, Isolde," he said, his voice dropping in pitch. "I came to warn you that Cillian's desperate attempts at money-making may lead him to speak rashly. Your connection to Ravenscar will soon be more widely known than I had intended." He moved closer, his dark shadow enveloping her. Isolde felt the sudden, alarming proximity of his formidable power. "I want to be clear," he continued. "If Cillian's recklessness draws any unsavory attention toward Ravenscar, attention that threatens the vow, I will not hesitate to silence him. I purchased his life once. I will not do so again." "You speak of silencing him," Isolde whispered, not recoiling, but holding his gaze. "Do you mean to have him killed?" The severity of his expression softened slightly, replaced by a deep melancholy. "I do not seek bloodshed, but I seek the protection of what is mine, Isolde. And you are now inextricably bound to Ravenscar. Be mindful that anything that threatens your safety threatens my purpose." He gave a slight, dismissive wave of his hand. "You have absorbed enough of my dark affairs for today. Now, to a lighter matter. I require a companion for dinner tonight, a quiet meal, no ceremony. You will dine with me in my private solar." It was not an invitation, it was an order, yet it was the first crack in the wall of their formal relationship. That evening, Isolde dressed with meticulous care. She chose a dark green gown, simple but elegant, which complemented the pale sweep of her throat and the silver raven pendant. The Duke's solar was a small, austere room adjacent to his study. It offered a breathtaking though unnerving view of the valley below, now cloaked in icy mist. The table was set for two, the light provided by several tall, flickering candles that cast the Duke's features in dramatic relief. Dinner was served by a single silent steward, who disappeared as soon as the plates were laid. The food was surprisingly delicate: roast pheasant, root vegetables, and a fine claret, a testament to the Duke's wealth, even in this remote fortress. The conversation began, as always, with a chilling formality. "How do you find your accommodations, Isolde?" he asked, using her Christian name with a detached precision that made it feel like a title. "Comfortable, Your Grace. Your staff is attentive. I spend much time in the library. Your collection is superb. You read well?" My father ensured I received a comprehensive education in literature, Latin and mathematics, she replied. A poor substitute for a dowry, perhaps, but a treasure nonetheless. The Duke paused, swirling the claret in his cup. I believe knowledge is the only treasure that cannot be sold, Lady Isolde. Tell me, what is your preferred reading? They spoke of philosophy and history for a time, a strange and exhilarating dance of intellect. Isolde found herself forgetting the Duke's fearsome reputation, drawn instead by the sharp brilliance of his mind. He was clearly a scholar and a deep thinker, a man haunted by ideas as much as by his destiny. You read the histories of our northern kings, Isolde observed gently. They are tales full of brutality and sorrow. Do you find comfort in them, Your Grace? He set down his cup with a controlled clink of crystal against wood. I find truth in them, Isolde. History proves that power is always earned through sacrifice, and that loyalty, particularly in these mountains, is a rarer commodity than gold. He looked directly at her, his grey eyes piercing. I, too, am a student of history, and I know that the Ashthorne name is not one of simple nobility. It is steeped in a vow made to protect this land and its bloodlines, and the time for that vow's fulfillment is rapidly approaching. Isolde felt a profound emotional trigger, the realization that this powerful man was not merely a tyrant, but a man burdened by an inherited fate. And that vow, it requires me? She asked, the curiosity overwhelming her fear. It requires a Harrington, he corrected, his tone cool. A member of a very specific, pure branch of that line. You were the last remaining ember, Isolde. Had Thorn extinguished you, the vow would have been broken, and the consequences would be catastrophic for all the North. He leaned closer, the candle flames reflecting in his intense gaze. I purchased you because you are a necessary key, Isolde, a piece of a centuries-old lock. I paid double the price not because you are worth more gold, but because your life is the ultimate insurance policy for the future of Ravenscar. The declaration, while brutally honest, strangely diminished her terror. She was not a victim, but an instrument of destiny. Then I am not your prisoner, Your Grace, she stated, lifting her chin. I am your shield. A low sound, half sigh, half reluctant acknowledgement escaped the Duke. Perhaps, but shields must be kept close and never allowed to wander into danger. The air thickened, no longer cold, but charged with the inexplicable tension of two powerful forces, one of destiny, one of will, finally locked in proximity. The dinner concluded swiftly after that, the unspoken promise of the vow hanging between them like a drawn sword. Isolde retired to her room, the silver raven on her neck feeling heavier than ever, understanding that her journey had only just begun. She was not just under the raven's shadow, she was becoming a part of it. The revelation that she was a necessary key rather than a mere captive shifted Isolde's perspective. Her fear did not vanish, but it was overlaid with a potent sense of purpose. If she was integral to an ancient destiny, then she would conduct herself with the gravity that role demanded. Her days at Ravenscar took on a new structure, driven by a quiet, determined study of her environment. She began observing the fortress itself. Ravenscar was, she realized, a machine of defense built around a deep vulnerability. The walls were impenetrable, but the atmosphere was one of perpetual vigilance, suggesting the Duke feared an enemy closer than London. Her observations of the Duke's inner circle were equally revealing. His most trusted confidant was a man named Gareth, the Duke's master of arms. Gareth was younger than the Duke, lean and hawk-eyed, with an air of respectful intensity. Isolde noted the way Gareth spoke to Damien, not with the cringing deference of a servant, but with the clipped, efficient language of an equal partner in danger. They often spoke in low, rapid tones, discussing movements in the south and the old border lines. One morning, Isolde watched from a high window as Damien and Gareth sparred in the cold, misty outer bailey. The Duke, shedding his heavy mantle, revealed a powerful physique tempered by rigorous training. His movements with the longsword were practiced, brutal, and efficient. The scar on his cheek seemed less a flaw and more a badge of honor as he moved. He moved with a controlled ferocity that fascinated and disturbed Isolde. He was not merely practicing, he was preparing for war. As they rested, Isolde overheard a fragment of their conversation, the words carried up on a blast of wind. "The reports from Derbyshire are troubling, Your Grace," Gareth said, breathing heavily. "The whispers about the Ashthorne lands grow louder. Some are calling it a cursed place ripe for the taking." Damien's voice was low and deadly. "Let them whisper. They forget that the only thing cursed at Ravenscar is the fate of those who trespass. Have you secured the passages?" "All sealed, Your Grace, but the true threat will not come from the common fool, but from the ambitious lord. They seek the power of the vow, not the land." The Duke looked up toward the castle, toward Isolde's window, though he could not possibly have seen her. "They seek to break the compact. They will not succeed." Isolde drew back swiftly, her heart pounding. The vow was clearly not a mere familial eccentricity, but a known, politically volatile entity. The life she now held was the nexus of a looming regional conflict. Isolde was determined to be more than a passive key. She was a woman of intelligence, and she owed the Duke more than just silent obedience. She began spending time in the library, not reading romance or history, but quietly cataloguing the Duke's less-used correspondence at his instruction. It was during this task that she stumbled upon a small, leather-bound ledger tucked beneath a pile of maps. It was Cillian's hand, not his casual scrawl, but meticulous, tiny writing. Curiosity overriding caution, Isolde opened the book. It was not a personal diary, but a detailed account of her brother's debts and, more disturbingly, his promises. It revealed that Cillian's financial ruin had not been solely due to reckless gambling and poor investments. He had been purposefully entrapped. And the man who had orchestrated the final fatal trap was Algernon Thorne. Thorne hadn't merely sought to acquire Isolde as a grotesque prize. He had been buying the Harrington estate piecemeal, waiting for the perfect moment to seize the Harrington key, Isolde herself, to gain favor with a more powerful, hidden patron. Isolde's eyes scanned the final pages, where Cillian had documented his final, most shameful act. "Thorne assures me if I make the girl available for his acquisition, he will not only clear my current ruin, but will grant me a minor estate near Kent and a modest annual income. The price is high, but the alternative is the dungeon. He assures me the girl will be well kept, as she is needed for his master's purpose, not his own base desires." The cold clarity of the betrayal struck Isolde harder than any physical blow. Cillian had known he was selling her into a complex, perilous game, not just into a merchant's lust. He had sold her and her crucial role in the vow for a chance at a petty, comfortable life near Kent. The Duke had suspected Cillian was weak. Isolde now knew he was calculating, cowardly, and deeply corrupt. She sat motionless, the small ledger resting on her lap, the weight of the realization crushing her. The man who had sworn to protect her had used her as currency in a dangerous political exchange. That evening, Isolde found the Duke in the library, staring into the dying embers of the fire. His profile, usually so severe, looked exhausted. Isolde, clutching the ledger, walked toward him. She did not bother with formalities. "Your Grace," she said, her voice shaking slightly, holding out the book. "I believe I have found information that is pertinent to your purpose." The Duke turned, his grey eyes instantly sharp, assessing the strain on her face and the small, incriminating book in her hand. "What is that, Isolde?" "My brother's true accounting. His ledger," she stated, placing it on the desk between them. "He was not merely cornered by Thorne, he was bribed. Thorne promised him an estate and an income if he delivered me. Cillian was a willing accomplice in my ruin and in the threat to your vow." Damien picked up the ledger and quickly flipped through the pages, his expression hardening with every line he read. The cold fury that emanated from him was terrifying, yet Isolde stood her ground. "He is worse than I imagined," the Duke finally muttered, slamming the ledger shut. "Thorne did not want you for his own wretched amusement. He was the buyer for a greater fool, someone who believed that by acquiring a Harrington they could gain leverage over the north." Isolde nodded. "Who is this master, Your Grace? Who is powerful enough to manipulate Cillian and buy a debt like that, and brazen enough to challenge the Ashthorne line?" Damien looked at her, and for the first time the impenetrable wall around him seemed to crack. He saw not a pawn but a partner in understanding the threat. "The Ashthorne vow involves the protection of a particular geographic and historical boundary, Isolde. It prevents the encroachment of certain southern lords who seek to claim the resources and strategic passes of the northern mountains. The most aggressive of these lords is the Earl of Warwick. Warwick believes that if he can break the Ashthorne dominance, he can solidify his own power base and eventually challenge the king's authority in the north. He ran a hand over his scarred cheek, a gesture of deep weariness. The vow requires the presence of an unblemished Harrington of the main line to maintain its sanctity. A centuries-old contract between my ancestors and yours. If a Harrington is corrupted, or worse, used by our enemies, the vow is weakened, and Warwick gains his foothold. So Thorn was Warwick's agent, Isolde concluded, the puzzle pieces clicking into place. He sought to acquire me to either corrupt me or use me as a shield against you. Precisely, the Duke confirmed. And your brother, with his reckless greed, played directly into their hands. I saved you from Thorn, but I did not save you from Warwick's machinations. The Earl will not simply abandon his prize. Isolde stepped around the desk, placing her hand on the aged ledger. I understand now, Your Grace. I am the key to this ancient protection. Then my compliance must be absolute, but my actions must be useful. Tell me, what can I do to aid you? I refuse to be merely a shield. Damien Ashthorne looked down at her, seeing the fire and steel in her eyes. It was not the plea of a grateful woman, but the declaration of a committed ally. He had purchased a key, but he had acquired a weapon. You, Isolde, can do the one thing I cannot. You can wait. You can remain the living proof that the vow holds firm, but I will do more than wait. I will use Cillian's greed against them. I will send a message that the Harrington key is secure, and that anyone who attempts to pry it loose will face the full wrath of Ravenscar. As he spoke, their eyes locked over the damning evidence of Cillian's betrayal. The danger was immense, the connection between them forged in crisis. The intellectual partnership had cracked the surface of their formal relationship, revealing a nascent, powerful alliance, a strategic intimacy far more dangerous than any simple attraction. The discovery of Cillian's ledger did more than simply clarify the threat. It provided Damien with a crucial opportunity to act. His policy of quiet vigilance had been forced into a strategic offensive, and Isolde, the seemingly passive key, was now positioned as the silent, unassailable cornerstone of his defense. Isolde, having faced the lowest ebb of her brother's treachery, found a strange kind of peace. Her life was dangerous, but no longer meaningless. She was bound not by chains, but by the weight of a destiny she accepted. The Duke, for his part, executed his plan with chilling efficiency. We will not inform Cillian that we know the full extent of his dealings, Damien instructed Isolde 2 days after their conversation in the library. They were in his study, surrounded by the maps of the north. He will remain ignorant, serving as an unwitting messenger. But we will make a display of the Harrington estate's sudden stability. He detailed his plan. He would send a carefully crafted letter to a London solicitor, who was also an acquaintance of the Earl of Warwick. The letter would detail the Duke's complete purchase of all outstanding Harrington debts, including those held by Thorn, and an additional endowment of a generous annuity paid directly to Isolde, ensuring her financial independence. The annuity ensures your status is elevated beyond that of a mere captive or dependent, Damien explained, tracing a line on a parchment map. It makes you a client of Ravenscar. More importantly, it demonstrates to Warwick that the key is not only secured, but that the connection between the Ashthorne and Harrington lines is now voluntary and financial, a fortress he cannot besiege. And Cillian? Isolde asked, her voice flat. Cillian will be informed that a small but binding portion of that annuity is conditional upon his maintaining a respectable silence in Kent. If he speaks of the transaction or of Ravenscar even once, the payment ceases. His greed, Isolde, will become his silencer. It was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly effective. The Duke used the very weapon that had brought Isolde to ruin, her brother's venality, to secure her safety. Isolde felt a cold admiration for his tactical brilliance. I agree to this, Your Grace, she stated. It is the most judicious use of the circumstances. Good, he replied, looking up from the map. His eyes lingered on her face, a rare moment where the intensity of his gaze was not purely analytical. You have absorbed this crisis with remarkable fortitude, Isolde. Most women would have collapsed. My spirit was already broken by the pestilence and my parents' loss. The rest was merely a confirmation of the world's harshness, she replied quietly. He did not offer meaningless platitudes. Instead, he inclined his head slightly. Then you are well suited for the life at Ravenscar. You are not frightened by shadows, and we have many here. As the Duke initiated his gambit, their working relationship was forced into a state of intense, almost domestic proximity. Damien required Isolde to assist him in cataloguing the Harrington estate documents, believing her familiarity with her family's affairs would reveal any hidden traps set by Thorn. They spent hours together in the vast, echoing library. The only warmth came from the fire and the shared concentration on the dry legal parchments. This was where the tension between them began to shift from intellectual alliance to something distinctly personal and dangerous. One evening, Isolde was leaning over a deed, pointing out a discrepancy in a property boundary, when the Duke leaned in beside her. His presence was overwhelming, the faint, clean scent of wool and cold air, the sheer bulk of his shoulder inches from hers. "The boundary marker is here," Isolde murmured, her breath catching as his large, powerful hand brushed against her forearm while pointing with a quill. "The manor line runs down to the river Cynos, yes," Damien confirmed, his voice low, his attention focused on the document. Yet Isolde could feel the subtle shift in the air, the way the simple contact of skin against skin seemed to electrify the silence. She quickly drew her hand away, feigning interest in the script. "It is a messy boundary. My father often spoke of disputes with the neighboring landowner." "Disputes are always messy," the Duke noted, not referring to the land, but to the unspoken, fragile peace between them. He straightened, giving her the space she instinctively craved and dreaded. She looked at the harsh scar on his face, momentarily forgetting the documents. "Did you earn that in a boundary dispute, Your Grace?" The question was blunt, violating their established boundary of non-inquiry, but the Duke did not dismiss it. He ran 2 fingers lightly along the silvery track. "No, Isolde, I earned this defending the integrity of the vow itself years ago. I was younger and perhaps not as strategic as I am now. The scar reminds me that brute force is often insufficient. Subtlety and the unwavering defense of what is mine is paramount." He looked at the raven pendant around her neck, then back to her eyes. The implication was clear. "You are mine." That night, Isolde understood that the strategic intimacy was beginning to erode the Duke's carefully constructed isolation. He was accustomed to commanding respect, but she commanded his attention, first intellectually, and now, perhaps, physically. The constant required proximity was a slow poison to his discipline. The Ashthorn vow, Isolde discovered, was not a secret to the Duke's staff, but a matter of severe family duty. The staff, fiercely loyal, treated Isolde with a quiet, respectful deference that bordered on reverence, confirming her importance as the key. It was Mrs. Elms, the stoic housekeeper, who inadvertently provided Isolde with a moment of insight into the Duke's character. Isolde found Mrs. Elms tending to a small enclosed garden near the inner keep, the only concession to softness in the entire fortress. "Mrs. Elms," Isolde approached the elderly woman quietly, "does the vow explain the Duke's solitude? He seems a man determined to be alone." Mrs. Elms stopped clipping a hardy rosebush, her eyes distant. "His Grace carries the weight of a generation of silence, Lady Isolde. The vow requires the Duke to remain unmarried and uncommitted until the time of its fulfillment, to avoid introducing any variable that could weaken the bond. He must be pure in his focus. He has endured years of whispers and rumors in the courts, enduring the solitude of Ravenscar to protect his line in the north." Isolde was stunned. The feared, cold Duke had sacrificed his personal life, his happiness, and his companionship for a sworn duty. His very isolation was an act of profound, disciplined sacrifice. "He is a good man, lady," Mrs. Elms said softly, as if reading Isolde's thoughts, "but the vow demands a great cost. It demands a heart of ice to keep the passions from interfering with the duty." Later that week, the reality of the vow hit home. Isolde was in her room, struggling to latch a heavy silver bracelet, when Damien, passing by, stopped and knocked. "I came to ensure you had what you needed for the evening," he said, stepping just inside the threshold. "I'm quite well, Your Grace," she replied, holding out the heavy bracelet. "Only this refuses to cooperate." He took the bracelet and approached. The silence was instantly charged. As his large, warm fingers worked the delicate clasp, Isolde felt the heat radiating off his body, the intensity of his focus. He was so close she could feel the faint movement of his breathing. When the clasp clicked shut, his fingers lingered for a fraction of a second on the sensitive skin of her inner wrist. He looked up, their eyes meeting. The physical intimacy of the small action shattered the ice between them. In his grey eyes, Isolde saw not the cold strategist, but a man starving for warmth, for human connection, disciplined into silence by his sacred, lonely duty. "There," he murmured, his voice husky. He released her wrist and stepped back instantly, rebuilding the distance between them, his face returning to its familiar mask of discipline. "Thank you, Your Grace," Isolde whispered, her own heart pounding a desperate rhythm against her ribs. He offered a curt nod and left without another word, closing the door softly behind him. But the moment had revealed a chasm of mutual, unacknowledged yearning. The strategic intimacy had given way to an emotional trigger. The Duke was committed to isolation for the vow, and Isolde was the living embodiment of the reason for that isolation. They were bound by a sacred promise and separated by the painful necessity of its demand. Damien's strategic gambit, using Cillian's greed as a silencer and establishing Isolde's financial autonomy, had the intended effect. It served as a calculated provocation to the Earl of Warwick, making it clear that the Harrington key was secured under the impregnable banner of the Ashthorne Raven. Warwick, a man known for his impatience and ambition, could not tolerate this checkmate. His initial subtle plan through Thorne had failed, and the Duke's boldness demanded an immediate, visible response. 2 weeks after the annuity was established, the Duke summoned Isolde to his study. The room felt charged with the gravity of impending action. "Warwick has taken the bait," Damien stated without preamble. He paced the room, his long strides reflecting his restless energy. "His agent, a petty lordling named Sir Kempt, has suddenly appeared near the old Harrington lands in the south, making loud, public declarations that the Duke of Ravenscar is holding Lady Isolde against her will, citing the lack of marriage contract and the speed of the debt settlement as proof of abduction." Isolde stiffened. "He challenges your honor, Your Grace." "He challenges the legitimacy of the vow," Damien corrected, his voice a low growl. "If he can successfully paint you as my prisoner, it undermines the voluntary nature of the Harrington Key's presence here. It implies coercion, which, in the eyes of the court and the ancient contract, weakens the vow's protective power over the north." He stopped pacing and faced her. "I cannot afford to let this rumor fester. I must go south to the marches of Warwick's lands and publicly refute this challenge. I must show strength, and more importantly, I must secure intelligence on Warwick's real plans." The news hit Isolde with the chilling weight of renewed danger, not for herself, but for the Duke. "You will leave Ravenscar? Is that wise, given the importance of your presence here?" "It is necessary," he confirmed. "Gareth will command the fortress in my absence, but my departure creates a vacuum, a lure. Warwick will see this as his opportunity to strike directly at the heart of the vow. You." Damien walked to his massive, secure vault and withdrew a heavy iron key, handing it to Isolde. It was the key to his private study and the library where the most sensitive documents were kept. "You are not to leave your chambers without Mrs. Elmes or Gareth accompanying you. You will dine in private, but during the day you will keep the key to this study. If any attempt is made upon your person, Isolde, you will come here, lock the door, and sound the bell hidden beneath the desk. Do you understand? Your safety is paramount, not just to me but to the whole of the North." His trust in her, a woman he had bought just weeks ago, was absolute, terrifying, and profoundly moving. "I understand, Your Grace," she replied, clutching the heavy, cold key. "I will not fail the vow." The next morning, the Duke rode out of Ravenscar, accompanied by a small, elite contingent of his most loyal men and Gareth's younger brother, Rhys. His departure left an aching void in the fortress. The cold walls seemed colder, the silence deeper. Isolde, however, found herself galvanized by the necessity of her vigil. She spent her days precisely as the Duke commanded: quiet study, careful cataloguing, and meticulous observation. She felt the heavy responsibility of the iron key in her possession. The days passed slowly. Isolde found herself missing the Duke's formidable presence, the sharp intellectual sparring, and the alarming moments of proximity that had fractured her reserve. She realized with a startling clarity that sent a blush to her cheeks that she was falling in love with her guarded, scarred captor. She loved the strength born of duty, the mind honed by scholarship, and the discipline that masked a heart capable of profound, selfless sacrifice. This realization only heightened her sense of duty. She had to protect his purpose. The threat, however, was not the grand frontal assault Isolde had expected. It was subtle, insidious, and domestic. 4 days into the Duke's absence, Isolde noticed a detail that chilled her blood. She was closing the heavy velvet curtains in the library, and her eye caught a faint, almost invisible smudge of mud on the polished stone floor, right at the foot of one of the tall, narrow windows. The mud was unusual. All the stone floors in Ravenscar were meticulously scrubbed daily by the household staff, and the castle had been dry for days. Furthermore, that particular window was locked and barred from the inside, overlooking a treacherous sheer drop, an access point no one in their right mind would attempt. Later that evening, while reading in her chamber, she noticed another discrepancy. Mrs. Elmes had placed a vase of fresh, if somewhat meagre, winter flowers on her bedside table, a rare touch of colour. Yet, among the hardy blossoms, Isolde saw a small dried heather sprig, a plant that did not grow in the immediate environs of Ravenscar, but was common in the foothills far to the north, near the unsealed ancient passes. The trespass was internal. The enemy was already inside. A sudden, paralyzing thought struck her. The Duke's orders had been absolute. If any attempt is made upon your person, Isolde, you will come here, lock the door, and sound the bell. This was not an attempt upon her person yet. This was an investigation, a subtle breach of security designed to locate the sacred documents or the true nature of the vow. Isolde did not panic. She acted. She took the iron key, wrapped her thick shawl around her shoulders, and slipped quietly down the shadowed corridor to the Duke's study. Inside, she locked the heavy door, her hands shaking slightly. She went directly to the desk and reached beneath it for the emergency bell. Her fingers brushed the cool metal, but she hesitated. Sounding the alarm now would reveal that the security had been breached, but it wouldn't expose the intruder. The enemy was cunning. They would vanish immediately. She stood perfectly still, listening to the silence of the fortress. If they are already here, she reasoned, they are likely searching for the documentation related to the vow, or perhaps for a weakness in the fortress itself. She went to the massive map table where she and the Duke had worked, pretending to examine the maps. As her eyes scanned the intricate drawings, she deliberately knocked over a stack of official, sealed royal decrees with a loud thud. Then she held her breath and waited. For a full minute, nothing. Then, from the inner wall, the wall that housed the Duke's hidden vault and the unused ancient well shaft, she heard a noise, a very faint, almost imperceptible scrape of leather against stone. Someone was behind the wall, listening, waiting, believing Isolde was just a clumsy woman. Isolde turned her back to the wall, deliberately obscuring it, and slowly, cautiously, she reached for the hidden bell, but she didn't ring it. Instead, she took the heavy iron key and inserted it into the lock of the vault. She turned it, the mechanism grating with a loud theatrical clang. She then opened the heavy vault door a mere crack, ensuring the shadow of the opening was visible from the hidden position. She knew the enemy would be unable to resist. They would assume the key was attempting to access the vow documents for her own protection, or perhaps to retrieve a vital secret. Isolde then turned, placed a large heavy book directly atop the bell to muffle any accidental noise, and waited. A small silver letter opener gripped tightly in her hand, positioning herself in the deepest shadow near the fireplace. She had traded one danger for another. She was the bait, using the Duke's own secrets to lure the predator into the open. The silence in the Duke's study stretched, heavy and expectant. Isolde stood by the fireplace, the silver letter opener clutched in her hand, her heart hammering a wild, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She had committed to the dangerous gamble. She had opened the vault and waited for the intruder, forcing the conflict to her terms. The scraping sound from behind the inner wall intensified. It was followed by a low, metallic groan, the sound of an old stone being shifted. Isolde knew she had mere seconds before the spy emerged from the hidden passage. The section of the wall near the vault, masked by a crumbling ancient tapestry, began to tremble. A narrow slit appeared, revealing the tip of a boot, then a hand. Isolde focused on the vault, lifting the heavy ledger that contained Cillian's confession. She raised her voice, deliberately projecting it toward the open crack in the vault door. "He is gone, the fool," she murmured, simulating panic. "The Duke is gone. I must see if I can find the Harrington deed before the Earl's men arrive. I cannot allow them to claim that ancient lineage." She saw the intruder hesitate. The lie had worked. The spy believed she was a panicked noblewoman seeking a vital document. Then, with a final, grinding sound, a man squeezed through the aperture. He was not a typical cutthroat, but a compact, agile man dressed in the common brown tunic of a traveling merchant, his movements too practiced for the role. He looked around the study, his eyes sharp and venomous. When his gaze landed on Isolde, frail in her evening gown holding a letter opener, a sneer of contempt curled his lip. "Well, well, the celebrated Harrington key," the man hissed, drawing a short, wickedly sharp blade. "I expected a fiercer guard, lady. I see the Duke values his little key so little he leaves her to fumble with his locks." "You are Warwick's man," Isolde stated, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her. "I am the man who will find what the Earl is owed," he corrected, taking a slow, predatory step toward her. His eyes flickered to the slightly ajar vault. "I believe the Duke has kept the evidence of the vow here. Hand over the documents, lady, and I will be generous enough to leave you with your worthless life." Isolde raised the heavy ledger higher. She knew her only chance was to buy time and to force the confrontation to happen within earshot of the main hall, hoping Gareth or the guards would investigate the unusual noise. "The documents are not what the Earl seeks," Isolde challenged, trying to sound authoritative. "He seeks the power of the vow which is bound to my presence here, not merely to paper, and you will not leave this room alive." The spy laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Brave words from a woman who was sold like chattel. The only power you hold is the power to be a pathetic victim." As he lunged, Isolde threw the heavy ledger directly at his head. The move was unexpected, and the book struck the spy's temple with a solid thud. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. This was the distraction she needed. Isolde did not attempt to flee or fight. Instead, she sprinted to the massive stone fireplace and seized the heavy iron poker. She swung it with all the strength she possessed, not at the spy, but at the heavy iron andirons that held the logs. The sound of metal clashing against metal and logs tumbling onto the stone floor echoed through the stone walls of Ravenscar, a violent, undeniable sound of crisis. The spy recovered, his face twisted in a mask of murderous rage. He charged, ignoring the vault, focused now only on silencing the alarm. Isolde backed away, holding the poker defensively, realizing her small victory would cost her dearly. Just as the spy raised his knife for the killing blow, the heavy oak door of the study exploded inward. Gareth, the master of arms, stood framed in the doorway, his broadsword already halfway from its scabbard, his face a grim mask of immediate, decisive action. "Treachery!" Gareth roared, recognizing the intruder instantly. The spy, realizing his escape was now impossible, made one last desperate attempt to strike Isolde. Gareth was too fast. The massive sword swept through the air, catching the spy's knife hand with a sickening finality. The man screamed, and the knife clattered uselessly to the floor. Two more of the Duke's men rushed in, quickly subduing the bleeding, struggling spy. Gareth rushed to Isolde, his face pale beneath the grime. "Lady Isolde, are you harmed?" Isolde lowered the poker, which now felt impossibly heavy in her numb hands. She was breathing in ragged gasps, her throat dry. "No, I am untouched. He came through the secret passage." Gareth looked from the subdued spy to the concealed open passage, then back to the deliberate wreckage of the fireplace. He understood immediately. "You lured him out." You sounded the alarm in a way that wouldn't alert the outside world, Gareth stated, admiration and shock warring on his face. You have the nerve of a true Ashthorn, lady. The threat was neutralized, but the cost was high. The security of Ravenscar had been compromised, and Isolde, while physically safe, was emotionally shattered by the brutal confrontation. She spent the rest of the night shivering in her chamber, the image of the drawn knife haunting her. Gareth ensured the spy was interrogated and secured. The man, weakened and broken, confessed immediately. He was indeed an agent of the Earl of Warwick, tasked with finding and destroying the Harrington deed, the legal proof of the vow's legitimacy, thus crippling the Duke's claim to the north. Gareth sent a swift, urgent message to the Duke. Damien received the news on the southern marches. The report of the attempted assassination, not by outsiders but by a breach of his own walls, ignited a cold, incandescent fury in him that terrified his companions. The Duke had been prepared for a political war, but not a treacherous strike at the very life he was sworn to protect. He immediately abandoned his political mission and rode north, driving his horses and his men relentlessly for 3 days. He arrived at Ravenscar late at night, a grim, exhausted shadow of authority. He did not stop for food or rest. He went directly to Isolde's chamber. Isolde was sitting by her fire, dressed in a thick wrapper, attempting to read, but truly only staring into the flames. When the knock came, sharp, authoritative, yet familiar, she rose, her heart leaping. "Enter." The door opened and the Duke filled the space. His heavy coat was dusted with road dirt, his face pale and drawn from lack of sleep, the scar across his cheek standing out starkly against his skin. He looked like a man who had faced the devils of the road to return to his singular duty. He closed the door and simply looked at her, his grey eyes searching, intense, and finally, relieved. "Isolde." His voice was a low, rough exhalation of breath. "Gareth's report. Is it true you were unharmed?" "I am untouched, Your Grace," she confirmed, walking toward him. She saw not the feared Duke, but the man who had abandoned everything to ride to her side. Gareth arrived in time. Damien walked to her and stopped, the sheer force of his presence overwhelming. He did not speak but reached out and grasped her shoulders, his fingers flexing, checking, confirming her solid presence. His touch was not commanding, but deeply, urgently protective. "You lured him out," he stated, his voice incredulous. "You used the documents as bait. You risked your life." "I secured the vow, Your Grace," she corrected, looking up into his exhausted eyes. "Your safety and the vow's integrity are paramount. I am the key. I acted as such." The word key seemed to snap the last vestige of his cold discipline. He saw the fire in her eyes, the dignity in her stance, and the fragile tremor in her lip, the testament to her fear and her courage. He suddenly pulled her into his arms, the action entirely uncharacteristic and utterly desperate. His embrace was fierce, crushing, and entirely devoid of lust. It was pure, raw relief and a recognition of shared mortality. Isolde gasped, sinking into the protective harbor of his strength, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Never," he muttered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "Never risk yourself so recklessly again. Do you understand, Isolde? The vow means nothing if the cost is your life. I did not purchase you to be a martyr." He pulled back slightly, holding her face between his large, road-stained hands. His gaze was fierce, unmasked. "I left you as a shield, but I returned because I realized, on the road, that you have become something far more dangerous to me. You are not just the key, Isolde. You are the only source of light in this cold fortress, and the thought of losing you." He broke off, unable to articulate the depth of his fear. "I am not weak, Damien," she whispered, using his first name for the first time, cementing the profound shift in their relationship. "I know you are not," he replied, his eyes dark with the struggle between duty and desire. He leaned in slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to retreat. Isolde, tired of the silence, tired of the distance, and utterly committed to the man who had risked his life for her honor, did not move. He closed the distance. His kiss was not soft. It was the demanding, profound expression of a man who had suppressed every physical and emotional need for a lifetime, now released by the terrifying threat of loss. It was a kiss of relief, of fear, of duty. and of a burgeoning, inevitable love. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing heavily. The vow is close to fulfillment, Isolde. But until that moment, there can be no compromise. You are the key. I must remain pure in my duty, he stated, his voice a battle between desire and discipline. He was confessing his feelings and reinforcing his boundaries in a single painful breath. I understand, she murmured, still holding on to his thick coat. I will not forget your duty, Damien, but I will not forget this either. He released her slowly, regret heavy in his stance. He was the Duke again, but his eyes held the vulnerability of the man who had almost lost his light. The kiss in Isolde's chamber had cracked through years of Damien Ashthorne's self-discipline, but it had not broken the vow. He was a man of duty, and the attraction he felt toward Isolde, the key, was the most dangerous threat to his mission. He knew that the only way to protect her and himself was to hasten the resolution of the conflict with Warwick. The next morning, Ravenscar's formality was restored, but the tension between them had become an underground current, powerful and palpable in the air. The Duke summoned Isolde to his study. Gareth and Mrs. Elmes were present, but he spoke only to Isolde. Warwick's spy has been captured and has confessed, Damien began, his voice returning to the cold, authoritative tone she knew. His confession validates my narrative. Isolde Harrington is at Ravenscar of her own will to protect her lineage and her lands, but the king's court is slow and skeptical. He extended an old parchment, yellowed with age and sealed with the crushed emblem of a long-forgotten king. This is the ancient vow, he declared, the agreement between the Ashthornes and the Harringtons. It states that, to seal the protection of the northern borders, the Ashthorne line must shelter and protect the last pure Harrington lineage until the southern border conflict is resolved. Most importantly, it dictates the only condition under which the vow is permanently fulfilled and the protection is irrevocable. Isolde took the parchment, the dry, cold leather brushing her fingers. "What is the condition, Your Grace?" she asked, feeling a shiver of foreboding. Damien looked at her directly, his dark grey eyes filled with painful resignation. "The vow requires that the union be sealed, for the protection of the border, to become unquestionable before God and the King. The Harrington line must be absorbed into the Ashthorne line through a marriage of convenience." The word echoed in the room. Isolde felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. She had been bought as a possession, made an ally, and now demanded as a wife, not out of love but because of a centuries-old contract. "A marriage," Isolde whispered. "But you said the vow required you to remain uncommitted." "Until its resolution," Damien corrected. "Marriage is the final point, the resolution. It does not require a marriage of love, nor even a consummated one. It requires a legal union to bind our houses. Warwick needs me to remain without a queen in the north, because an unmarried duke is a duke more easily removed. A married duke, with the key, cements our authority forever. It is the only maneuver the vow allows to silence Warwick completely." The Duke continued, his voice firm, establishing terms with the precision of a general on the battlefield. "We will marry by proxy in 1 week, a private rite, with a royal envoy here in Ravenscar. Then we will make a public appearance at the King's Court in York. This is a contract of honour, Isolde. You will have the title of Duchess of Ravenscar, total security, and the full respect my name commands. In return, you will be the pillar of my defence and the seal of my authority." He moved to the side of the desk, placing his hands on the carved oak. "The personal terms are as follows. This will be a nominal marriage. You will have your own chambers, separate from mine. Our intimacy will be strictly political. The vow does not demand an heir, it demands only the union. I made a vow of discipline for years, and I will uphold it to protect what matters most, your safety and the vow. I am the Ice Duke, Isolde, and this marriage will be of ice unless you demand otherwise." Isolde looked at the man before her. He was offering her everything, title, wealth, security, and the freedom of her body, in exchange for her role in the fate of the North. She saw honesty in his eyes, and the discipline battling the desire that their kiss had revealed. The question she had to ask was not about safety, but about the truth she had discovered in her own heart. "And if I do not wish for a marriage of ice, Damien?" she asked, using his name to challenge the formality of the moment. The Duke closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing instant. When he opened them again, fear and longing flickered in their grey depths. "Then you will place me in danger, Isolde," he whispered, his voice rough. "I am a man broken by duty. The vow demanded my solitude for so long that any passion now could blind me to Warwick's threat. I swore I would not use you. But if you bring warmth into my bed, I will be unable to resist you, and that will endanger us both. The price of our union may be the fall of the North." Isolde understood the depth of his sacrifice. He was not rejecting her. He was protecting her and their purpose from himself. She drew a deep breath and made her decision. She would not be his weakness. She would be his strength. "I accept the terms of the vow and the marriage of convenience, Your Grace," she declared, her voice steady, restoring the formality he required. "I will be your Ice Duchess, and your title will be unquestionable." The wedding took place as a silent, austere rite. A royal chaplain, brought under heavy escort, officiated the union in Ravenscar's small cold chapel. Isolde wore a simple grey silk dress, her only jewel the heavy raven and vine pendant. At the altar, when Damien slid the forged iron ring, the ancient Ashthorn matrimonial ring, onto her finger, their skin brushed. The shock of it contradicted the coldness of the ritual. The Duke, standing at her side, was a pillar of discipline. He did not smile, did not touch her beyond what was required. Only during the moment of kissing the bride did he bow his head, and instead of kissing her lips, he pressed his cool, dry mouth to her forehead, a gesture of respect, restraint, and a terrible promise of distance. "Duchess Ashthorn," he murmured formally, his gaze intense, "welcome to your destiny." And so Isolde Harrington became the Duchess of Ravenscar, the Ice Duchess, wife to a man who loved her in secret but kept her at a distance out of duty. The marriage was only the preparation for the final confrontation. 3 days later, the Duke and Duchess, accompanied by Gareth and an imposing troop of men, set out for York, where the king was gathered in council. They were not travelling alone. On the first day, a messenger intercepted the convoy with an urgent missive from the Earl of Warwick. Damien read the parchment, and his expression shut like an iron trap. He handed it to Isolde. "To the Duchess of Ravenscar, Isolde, formerly Harrington. I know your union is not of the heart but of coercion. I know your brother, Cillian Harrington, still harbours deep resentment for your sale and imprisonment, and that he alone possesses the true proof of the Duke's tyranny. I have summoned him to the court at York. He is prepared to testify that your presence in Ravenscar is a lie, and that the Duke forced this marriage to consolidate usurped power. Come to me in York, Isolde. Denounce this forced marriage, and I will guarantee your freedom and your brother's safety. Otherwise, he will pay the price of your loyalty to a tyrant, your true protector, Warwick." Cillian's betrayal had reached a new low. He had not only sold Isolde, but now was willing to climb the gallows to testify against her and the Duke, merely to avenge his wounded pride, and perhaps earn himself a new reward. "He is a fool," Damien said, rage simmering beneath his control. "He has given Warwick the only weapon the Duke cannot tolerate, a lie at the heart of the vow." Isolde crushed the parchment in her fist. Her heart had hardened against her brother. "It is not a lie, Damien. The marriage is real, and my choice to stay is real. Cillian can testify about my sale, but he cannot testify about my spirit. I will go with you to York, and I will face him." The Duke nodded. He saw the unshakable strength of his Duchess. "Then so be it," he declared, gazing down the road leading south. "If Warwick wants a court, he will have one. But it will not be Cillian who gives the testimony. It will be you, Isolde, the key of the North." The journey south to York was swift and tense. Isolde and Damien occupied the heavy emblazoned coach, bound together by the secret kiss and the solemn contract of their ice marriage. The Duke's men rode around them, a disciplined, formidable black wave, signalling that the Lord of Ravenscar was not coming to plead, but to impose his will. Isolde, now officially the Duchess of Ravenscar, wore her new title like a steel sheath. She studied the documents of the vow and the detailed ledgers of the Harrington lands. She was no longer just the key. She was the protector of the very contract that gave her husband his authority. The great hall in York, where the king held his temporary court, was a spectacle of medieval political theatre. Lords and ladies, dressed in rich silks and heavy jewels, whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with anticipation. The entrance of the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscar was the highlight of the day. Damien Ashthorne entered first, his towering presence silencing the room instantly. He was dressed in black velvet and heavy silver armor, a walking embodiment of northern strength. He moved like a king returning to his throne. Isolde followed, her spine rigidly straight. She wore a gown of deep sapphire, which served as a striking contrast to the Duke's darkness, and the silver raven pendant shone brilliantly against her pale throat. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her composure, her total lack of fear, that held the attention of the court. She looked every inch the Duchess of Ice, proud, unapproachable, and utterly loyal. They advanced to the foot of the dais where the king sat, a weary man attempting to mediate the volatile temperaments of his nobles. The Earl of Warwick stood opposite them, a handsome, polished man with a viperous smile. By his side stood Cillian Harrington. Isolde's breath hitched upon seeing her brother. He was dressed in fine, if slightly gaudy, new clothes provided by Warwick. He looked relieved, cowardly, and completely arrogant, clearly believing he was now under the protection of a greater, more powerful master. "Your Majesty," Damien's voice boomed through the hall, a sound of undeniable authority. "I stand here with my wife, the Duchess Isolde, to answer the scurrilous charges leveled by the Earl of Warwick, charges that seek to undermine the ancient authority of the North and the integrity of the Ashthorne vow." Warwick smiled, a condescending gesture. "The charges are simple, Your Majesty. This man, the so-called Duke of Ravenscar, kidnapped the Lady Isolde, a woman of the southern marches, bought her from a filthy debt collector, and forced her into an unholy union to cement his illegitimate power. He has produced documents, yes, but only the living word of the Harrington family can prove this a sham. And the living word stands right here." Warwick placed a possessive hand on Cillian's shoulder. "Cillian Harrington, the head of his house, is here to testify that the Duke's actions were an act of tyranny and that the Lady Isolde is his prisoner." The king nodded wearily. "Cillian Harrington, approach the dais, swear on the cross, and tell this court the truth of your sister's journey to Ravenscar." Cillian, puffing out his chest, walked forward. He avoided Isolde's gaze completely. "Your Majesty," Cillian began, his voice high and slightly nervous, but loud enough for all to hear, "I testify that I was forced to sell my sister to Algernon Thorne to clear an insurmountable debt. I was coerced. And I testify that the Duke of Ravenscar, by paying off that debt, merely exchanged one form of captivity for another. Isolde is his prisoner, held only by fear, and this marriage is a sham forced upon a desperate, ruined woman." A murmur rippled through the court. Warwick looked triumphant. The king turned to Isolde. "Duchess Isolde, we must hear from you. Is this true? Were you forced to marry the Duke of Ravenscar against your will?" Isolde stepped forward, drawing every eye in the hall. She was magnificent in her controlled stillness. She looked past the king, past Warwick, and settled her eyes on her brother. "Cillian," she said, her voice clear, ringing with quiet condemnation, "tell the court the whole truth. Tell them what you received from Algernon Thorne for my sale. I tell them of the promised estate in Kent, the modest income, and the promise of a comfortable life you secured for yourself by betraying the oath you swore over our parents' graves." Cillian froze. The colour drained from his face. The court held its breath. "Tell them," Isolde continued, her voice gaining strength, "that you did not sell me to save the family honour, but to purchase your own greedy freedom, and that now you stand here as a perjurer, willing to sell my safety and my husband's honour for the empty promise of the Earl of Warwick." Cillian stammered, unable to speak. The exposed truth of his pure selfishness was far more damning than any accusation of kidnapping. Isolde turned to the king, her eyes blazing with conviction. "Your Majesty, my brother sold me like cattle. My husband, the Duke of Ravenscar, paid double the price for me not because he desired me, but because he saw a noble spirit being corrupted for the nefarious political purposes of the Earl of Warwick. The Duke offered me safety, honour, and the chance to protect the integrity of the vow that secures his lands." She looked at Damien, and for the first time she allowed her face to soften, allowing a look of deep, loyal affection to shine through the formality. "I am no prisoner, Your Majesty. I chose to marry the Duke of Ravenscar because his integrity, his discipline, and his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for the sake of his people and the North proved him the most honorable man I have ever known. I stand here, his willing wife, the Duchess of Ravenscar, and I testify that this union is real, it is binding, and it is a defense against the treachery of men like my brother and the opportunistic greed of the Earl of Warwick." A roar of approval erupted from the hall. Cillian was instantly disgraced, clutching at his throat, realizing his final act of treachery had destroyed his name forever. Damien, recognizing the decisive victory, stepped forward, placing a steady, protective hand on Isolde's shoulder, a touch that was both a proprietary claim and a loving acknowledgement. "My wife speaks the truth, Your Majesty," the Duke stated. "The vow is now sealed. But the Earl of Warwick has questioned the nature of the vow itself, and I will reveal it to the court now, so that no man may ever challenge its terms again." He looked directly at Warwick, who now stood pale and defeated. "The vow requires the Ashthorne Duke to be unmarried and devoted solely to the North until the moment the Harrington Key is secured and the borders are stable. But the vow also carries a cost, a sacrifice I accepted years ago to maintain the integrity of my rule. It is why I remained isolated at Ravenscar, and why my enemies saw a chance to ruin me through a false narrative of forced marriage." He paused, and the silence in the hall was absolute. Isolde looked up, confused, sensing a hidden layer of the truth. "The true terms of the ancient Ashthorne vow," Damien declared, his voice ringing with profound pain and authority, "are that to ensure the Duke's complete, undiluted focus on the protection of the borderlands, he must never claim a true heir of the bloodline. The Duke of Ravenscar must sacrifice his chance at true fatherhood to maintain his unbreakable focus on the North's defense. My marriage to Isolde secures the land, but it means there will be no Ashthorne heir born to inherit my title." The court gasped. The Duke was revealing a lifelong agonizing sacrifice. He was willing to end his own direct line to secure the kingdom. "I have kept this secret to protect the vow's sanctity, enduring the whispers and the loneliness," Damien concluded. "But I reveal it now to show the court that my marriage is not an act of power consolidation, but an act of self-sacrifice demanded by a higher duty." Warwick, who sought to break this vow, sought not just my land but the destruction of a centuries-old protection pact designed for the entire kingdom. The verdict was immediate and absolute. The king, deeply moved and politically satisfied, stood. "The Duke of Ravenscar is exonerated. The Duchess Isolde is a willing, noble and loyal wife. The Ashthorne vow stands. Earl of Warwick, your suit is dismissed, and you are ordered to immediately retreat from the southern marches." Cillian Harrington was seized by the Duke's guards, stripped of his fine clothes and thrown into a debtor's prison, a fitting final end to his greed. Damien turned to Isolde, his face reflecting the heavy price of his revelation. She reached up and touched his scarred cheek, silently acknowledging the agony of his sacrifice. She was his wife, the cornerstone of his power, but their relationship was sealed by the terrible terms of the vow. They had won the war, but at the cost of their future. The journey back to Ravenscar was a silent meditation on the harsh cost of their victory. Isolde was now the official Duchess of Ravenscar, revered by the court for her courage and loyalty. Damien was the hero of the North, his sacrifice a testament to his profound duty. Yet they were strangers bound by a political contract and separated by the very vow that had brought them together. The revelation that the vow prohibited an heir hung between them like a shroud. Isolde understood the discipline required of Damien, a sacrifice that crushed the hopes of a bloodline. He had chosen the stability of the North over the comfort of a family. Upon their return, the Duke and Duchess settled into a formal cold routine. They shared meals in silence, always under the watchful eye of the staff. Damien was more withdrawn than ever, throwing himself into securing the borders, while Isolde immersed herself in the only place she felt truly free, the library. She returned to the most ancient texts, particularly those concerning the Ashthorne and Harrington lineages, determined to find a clause, a subtle loophole, that could dissolve the cruel terms of the vow. One blustery afternoon, Isolde was examining the original vow scroll, the one Damien had presented at court, when she noticed a small, nearly effaced inscription in the margin, written in an archaic form of Northern English. The main text, written in Latin, confirmed the Duke's interpretation. The Ashthorn Duke must remain pure and unburdened by an heir until the vow's work is complete, lest he lose focus on the defense of the land. But the marginal script, faint and almost illegible, seemed to be a commentary, a hidden codicil known only to the original scribes. Isolde sent for the Duke immediately. He arrived, his face tired, but his eyes instantly focusing on the document she spread out on the desk. "What is this, Isolde?" he asked, his voice low. "Look, Your Grace, here." She pointed to the faded script. "It is almost gone, but it is not Latin. It is a dialect I recognized from an old border poem I found. It is a note, perhaps a condition from the original Harrington ancestor who signed the pact." Damien leaned close, his imposing form nearly eclipsing her. The proximity in the